Lebanon is in the grip of unprecedented protests. 1.5 million people.
The Prime Minister has agreed on reforms to help ease the country's financial crisis.
رغم القرارات التي اتخذتها الحكومة بهدف الإصلاح.
Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. Here are some of the media stories we're covering this week. The protests in Lebanon, a multifaceted story that many of the country's news outlets want no part of. In Ethiopia, a showdown between a media mogul and the winner of the Nobel Peace Prize, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed. Post-colonial residue. Governments in sub-Saharan Africa are still using laws that the colonists left behind to silence journalists. And never mind the tear gas. It is Lebanon, after all, and the beats must go on. For a week and a half now, the streets of Lebanon have been jammed with protesters, the biggest anti-government demonstrations there for 15 years. Among the aspects of this story that stand out, although it has since grown into a nationwide movement against government corruption and economic mismanagement, these protests were triggered by talk of a new tax on WhatsApp and other internet call services like Facebook Messenger and FaceTime. Secondly, while so much of Lebanese politics is sectarian, there is nothing factional about these demonstrations. The issues are economic. The protesters are a non-sectarian coalition. Not that you would know that watching some of the television channels coming out of Beirut. Unlike the movement they are supposed to be covering, much of Lebanon's media is split along sectarian lines. Some of the more independent outlets have jumped on this story, but those controlled by politicians have been spinning, downplaying, or just ignoring the unrest. That's what happens when the media play a central part in a system that so many citizens are trying to change. Our starting point this week is Beirut. Watching television in Lebanon these days, on some channels at least, is like watching a nation talking to itself.
حرام عليكم الناس جوعانة، الناس مريضة ما عم تلاقي أكل، حرام عليكم، حرام.
Channels like LBC and MTV and Al Jadid are just running constantly on the interviews of the crowd, basically telling the crowd to just speak. They talk about what happened to their family, they talk about their story.
ابني عم يشتغل متعلم بالجامعة بالLAU عم يشتغل بيرد على التليفونات الدجاج.
These reporters, they stand there and people just swarm around them and wait for their turn.
لكن معاشاتنا $500 دوام مع شغلنا 10 ساعات جار بيوتنا $700 بقى ما حكينا لا بالاكل ولا بالاشتراك ولا بالادويه ولا بالمستشفيات ولا بالعلم.
Talking about small issues, local issues, to bigger issues like, having a sectarian political system driven by warlords.
It is that system the protesters are out to change. But it was economic issues, power outages, water shortages, and proposed new taxes on basics like fuel, wheat, even online phone calls on platforms such as WhatsApp that first brought people onto the streets, which is where the domestic media come in with their built-in biases. Lebanese politics and power are carved up between political factions. The president comes from a Christian party. The Prime Minister's office is reserved for a Sunni Muslim, and a Shia Muslim always gets to be Speaker of the Parliament. Some of Lebanon's biggest TV channels, OTV, Future TV, and NBN, are owned by or aligned with those political parties. Then there's Hezbollah's Al-Manar TV and the state-owned channel Tele Lebanon, both of which downplayed the demonstrations or ignored them. Activists stormed Tele Lebanon's offices in protest. 3 other privately owned channels, apparently with agendas of their own, LBC, MTV, and Al Jadid, have all provided wall-to-wall coverage of the unrest.
The media landscape in Lebanon is monopolized by a handful of political dynasties, About 12 families own or control the entire mainstream media landscape. OTV, which is affiliated to the President's Party, on the very first night of the demonstrations, OTV was broadcasting a cooking show. OTV reporters on the ground have been forced to remove their logos from their microphones because protesters have simply refused to speak to them.
Every single media, every single newspaper has a particular political slant. So it comes as no surprise that OTV, that is facing the brunt of the insults, would not want to be broadcasting the protests with as much fervor as MTV and Al Jadid that are on the other side politically. When we look at media, we need to understand that live television is one of the cheapest forms of media. And so the majority of the stations, with the exception of Télé Liban, is out broadcasting live.
The channel called NBN, which is tied to the Speaker of Parliament, Nabih Berri, also one of Lebanon's most powerful figures. This channel has no reporters on the ground. They just are putting a shot of the crowd, and whenever they hear a protest chant they don't like, they actually mute the sound of the entire broadcast. So it's hilarious to just turn on a channel and they're speechless. These channels are literally speechless. NBN and OTV and others, and Al Manar, they're trying to direct what's happening. So they constantly have pundits on air, and they kind of dip in and out of the protest very strategically. Despite their best efforts, they still can't really control and direct the crowd. But they're trying very hard to do so.
Spare a thought for Lebanon's Prime Minister, Saad Hariri. Future TV, a channel his family controls, suspended operations last month due to financial difficulties. Hariri must feel like he's at a political gunfight, a factional free-for-all, having been suddenly disarmed of his own channel. Given all the criticism OTV has been taking for its coverage, we asked for an interview. We were told that an official at the Free Patriotic Movement, President Michel Aoun's party, could speak for the channel. That official defended OTV's journalism and directed our attention elsewhere, to the coverage on LBC, MTV, and Al Jadid.
OTV is covering the demonstrations, is taking the pulse of the street. They are sending their reporters sometimes to hostile surroundings, and these reporters are being cursed at and harassed because they are thought to be from the government's side, which is not the case. Some of these stations was being part of the demonstrations, inciting people, whereas usually the role of the media is to just take the pulse of the street and report what is happening. Look at international TV stations. Have you seen a TV station in France inviting people to go on manifestations with the Gilets jaunes? No, but they covered it, and this is how it should be done.
We looked for examples of what Haddad just described, channels inciting citizens to join the demonstrations. Although we found none, Al Jadid has tweeted out videos of Lebanese celebrities urging the channel's followers to go out on the streets. And some of those channels' reporters have lost, or at least parked, their objectivity on this story. Al Jadid correspondent Halima Tabia, for example, went viral after helping a protester escape arrest while she was live on the air.
As she was talking to another demonstrator, a young man was seen being pulled out of the crowd by assumingly security forces in civilian clothing. What she said at the time was that she had seen this young man distributing food to other demonstrators throughout the day, and that she had a duty to stand on his side. I think it was a commendable moment. As journalists, we are often pushed towards this creed of objectivity. We are asked to be neutral. But in reality, journalism should be a service in the public interest, and this is precisely what she did, and I think this is precisely why this moment went viral.
The prevailing distrust Lebanese have in their mainstream media has led them to lean on social media to share information. But unlike the Arab Spring, and regardless of the WhatsApp angle, this is no Facebook revolution. In some ways, it's bigger than that. Millions of Lebanese of all sects are not just out to bring down a lone dictator or a mere government. They want to overthrow a system, sectarian to the core, right down to the TV channels that are supposed to be telling their story. Their basic message? Regardless of what our politicians tell us, no matter how our media choose to report it, Lebanon doesn't have to be this way.
What is critically missed on the media side of the Lebanese protest is strong and effective dialogue with the alternative political groups. Because there seems to be this representation that there is no alternative to the sectarian political leadership, but there is. There are numerous alternative political parties that are secular, that are equipped, that are grounded, that have legitimacy from the people, and they need to be given stronger voices in the mainstream media so that we can actually lead our country forward.
We're looking at other media stories that are on our radar this week with one of our producers, Tarek Nafa. Tarek, 2 weeks ago, the Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed wins the Nobel Peace Prize. He helped forge that peace deal with neighboring Eritrea, ending a military stalemate that lasted 20 years. And this past week, a major media owner in the country says that he's now being targeted by government agents. What's the story?
So, Richard, this is a story about two powerful men in a new Ethiopia and a relationship that looks like it's gone sour. The Prime Minister, Abiy Ahmed, took power in 2018 after a wave of anti-government protests. And like you say, he's just been awarded a Nobel Prize. One journalist said that Abiy's arrival was, at the time, an Obama moment for Ethiopians. The media mogul you mentioned is Jawar Mohammed. He was a journalist and activist in exile, a controversial figure for a lot of people, but very much credited as a galvanizing force for Ethiopians. He shared videos and protest strategies from his living room come newsroom in Minnesota. After Abiy assumed power, Jawar returned to Ethiopia a very influential player with a formidable news station at his disposal, the Oromia Media Network. This is how Jawar described the Prime Minister when we spoke to him last year.
The kind of freedom that we see in Ethiopia today is unprecedented, but everybody has this doubt in their mind. Is this a dream? Is it going to last? Is this guy going to go into another dictator? We're going to continue to support him, but we're going to hold his feet to the fire as well, because there are a lot of promises he must keep.
So that's Jawar on Prime Minister Abiy in July 2018. Now on Tuesday, the Prime Minister issued a thinly veiled threat to Jawar in Parliament, saying if he continues to stir up unrest and undermine peace, the government would, quote, take measures.
Sounds like it didn't take long for those measures to take place.
Well, Jawar says that later that evening, a group of police officers showed up at his house after midnight, tried to dismiss his security detail, and there was a kind of confrontation. Jawar then goes on Facebook, and let's not forget, this is the guy who mobilized the masses in 2018, and thanks to his 1.75 million followers, by Wednesday morning, there were thousands on the streets, including outside his home, which you could say is rather convenient timing, because this week, Jawar also hinted he'll run for Prime Minister next year. The government, meanwhile, has categorically denied it has tried to arrest or harm Jawar Mohammed.
Okay, thanks, Tarek. Next, we're moving to a media story whose roots date back to the late 19th century. European powers were setting sail for Africa, sweeping across the continent, colonizing country after country. Once they took power, they wrote laws designed to ensure that the colonized would not rise up against the colonizers. Laws that could also be used to silence, censor, intimidate, or jail journalists who refused to toe the line. Come the late 1950s, Africans began revolting. And over the next decade or two, most countries would win their independence. However, much of the colonial legislation remains in place. And there is now a growing list of journalists in sub-Saharan Africa falling afoul of those laws. And they were never written with contemporary democratic societies in mind. The Listening Post's Nick Muirhead now on the colonial-era laws that still determine what can and cannot be reported in parts of sub-Saharan Africa.
October 2018, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, newspaper editor Sylvanie Kyaku was jailed for publishing articles critical of a bank. She was prosecuted under a defamation law dating back to 1940, when the DRC was a Belgian colony. November 2016, 5 Zambian radio journalists were arrested for allegedly calling a member of the ruling party a useless person. They were charged under Section 179 of the Zambian Penal Code, which dates back to British colonial times. And in another former British colony, Botswana, Utsa Mokone, a newspaper editor at the Sunday Standard, published a report that the former president was involved in a late-night car crash. He was charged with sedition.
I told my lawyer that, you know what, I am going to plead guilty to sedition because I believe I did the right thing. And if it's deemed seditious, so be it. But there was a change of government and the new government decided to drop the charges against me. But I was very disappointed that they withdrew the charges because that took away the only opportunity we had to challenge the constitutionality of the sedition laws.
So sedition, compared to a lesser offense of defamation, which we're much more used to, is very specific to who can allege sedition. It is people at the pinnacle of power in any society. The assumption is that the said comments, remarks, views expressed have a potential of causing a national security threat or a public order threat.
One suspects that because the newspaper was so independent and had been writing about other matters that was clearly upsetting the government of the day, that they used that as an excuse to move against the journalists. The irony, of course, is that the world looks at Botswana and sees it as a bastion of democracy and stable rule in sub-Saharan Africa. And yet, unfortunately, sedition still remains a crime in Botswana, and it is used to close down the democratic space.
Which is by design. Colonial-era laws weren't written to protect democracy, but to limit dissent. When countries like Britain, France, and Belgium established their African colonies in the late 19th century, the new colonial administrations expected journalists, who were almost exclusively white and mostly compliant, to highlight the achievements of government, perpetuating the notion of African dependence on colonial rule. They also wanted would-be opponents silenced, and a legal framework was created to that end. But when the decolonization process began in the late 1950s and African governments started coming into power, securing independence was the priority, not media freedom. And the new leaders saw value in the laws that they inherited.
What happened after independence? When our black leaders took over, before they were calling for a free media. But after that, they changed. They decided to use the strategy that was used by their colonial masters. And there was a reason for that.
Why? Because the nation building project, the forcing of people to now identify themselves as, let's say, Zambians, Botswana, now have to be centrally managed or centrally controlled. So in order to do that, the new governments found it necessary to send a single message as the only voice that had their good intentions, and everybody else was destroying what this government was trying to build.
Our leaders see the media as an opposition, and they don't understand the role of the media, because the older generation of our leaders were hiding behind this idea of nation building and cohesion.
We contacted multiple governments that still have colonial-era laws in place to ask why, decades after independence, those laws are still on the books. None of them got back to us. It's not just the legacy of colonialism that lingers on in Africa, but the legal residue of apartheid in South Africa. This year marks 25 years of democracy in the country, but journalists there still have to contend with laws that were designed to preserve white minority rule. The 1982 Protection of Information Act gave South Africa's apartheid government sweeping powers to keep secrets and silence journalists. In the democratic era, many of the provisions in that law are deemed unconstitutional, but that hasn't prevented its use.
A big surprise was last year when an investigative journalist called Jacques Poe, who had written a book called The President's Keepers, suddenly found himself on the receiving end of a police raid.
At the moment there's police officers.
Ostensibly because he had confidential information from the intelligence services in his possession. He's been charged under this act. And while the case hasn't moved ahead against him, it's still hanging over his head.
The ruling African National Congress has made several attempts to replace the 1982 Protection of State Information Act. Its version, the Protection of State Information Bill, even made it through Parliament. But campaigners, journalists and lawyers said it was new only in name and still gave the state unconstitutional powers. The bill remains unfinished business. It's been on the president's desk for 6 years now, awaiting signature. Until then, the apartheid-era law remains in force. Historic laws aside, there's an unwritten cultural code in the region. It's called Ubuntu, the idea in African culture that a shared sense of humanity builds and binds communities. The challenge for modern-day African societies and their leaders, who are no longer united by the common goal of ending colonial rule, is how to reconcile the reverence of Ubuntu with the irreverence of critical journalism.
Not too long ago in this very same Botswana, criticizing a public figure, especially political leadership, could be seen to be a lack of Ubuntu. But the attitudes are changing as people begin to identify themselves often as taxpayers and as citizens, where then their concerns these days are less about journalists lacking Ubuntu and more about the media or journalists not digging deep enough.
It's important that people realize that if they want to live in a democratic society, that there is no way that a government, a democratically elected government or a post-colonial government should be in a position to use colonial-era laws or apartheid laws to try and subjugate the population.
I am convinced that they want to keep those laws in the statute books because they have a vested interest. And there is no way these guys are going to voluntarily relinquish their power to the extent that journalists are able to criticize them freely.
And finally, back to Lebanon, and an angle that we did not touch on in our lead story. The Lebanese have a reputation for partying, okay? It's a stereotype. But as anyone who has ever been to Beirut will tell you, it is not entirely undeserved. And rather than putting their partying on hold while the politics plays out on the streets, they've combined the two activities. Video has emerged online of a demonstration/street party in Tripoli that looks like some kind of revolutionary rave. The DJ, Mahdi Karimeh, has quickly grown into a folk hero. Who knows? Maybe he'll be the country's next president. We'll leave you now with that Tripoli video and a few others, plus some tweets on the Lebanese practicing politics as only they can. And we'll see you next time here at The Listening Post.
معاش، ما بتذكر ولا بتاكل سلاحك ولا